I want to
My
see if I
name
can preempt
is-
him. I did
You
it.
beat me to it, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
My name is Matthew Sparazza.
Father
I'm
Sam
joined by my
Kachuba.
co-host, Father Sam Kachuba.
Man.
And of course, the wonderful Stephanie Gray Connors. Returnee to the show. We're grateful you're back. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me back. It's fun.
That's very kind of you to say. That's
Yeah.
let's not get too far ahead of ourselves here. We're just talking over each other at this point. That's great.
So we asked you to return so you could talk about your Dignity series, specifically the latest. Is it volume? Would that be the correct word? The latest volume of the Dignity series is on IVF, and it is through Word on Fire. The first, so this is the second one. The first one is on what again?
It's on assisted suicide.
Assisted suicide.
And the topic, what it's on, is also the title.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
On assisted suicide, on IVF, you get the picture.
best
And then
kind of
there's going to be
marketing.
subsequent ones with other authors.
Right. Well, so I actually, my first question isn't really about the on IVF volume, but rather what brought about you writing this series?
Well, so I would say it was actually the idea for this series was conceived by Word on Fire. And they really wanted to tackle a number of the life issues and the ones that perhaps weren't as addressed as often, you could say, in the church or the movement. So there, are a plethora of books on abortion, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But there are issues like assisted suicide, which is becoming more common. IVF, which you think about the presidential debates and how even that topic made its way into that. It seems to be in the news every other day of the week. Different people sharing their stories of their experiences of IVF. There's been legal policy battles over what, laws should be related to IVF. So kind of, I think the thinking was, let's take some of these issues where there hasn't been as much formation and provide formation. And it just so happened that as a pro-life apologetic speaker, I had started in more recent years to tackle these two topics at the opposite ends of life. And so they said, hey, we would love for you to write these, first two books, but they have other books coming down with other authors.
Oh, so you're not the exclusive author of the series?
No, it just looks like it because it just so happened that the first two topics were mine.
Right. Okay, noted.
How many other authors are going to be involved in this project then overall?
Now, you froze on my end. Did I freeze on your end?
No. No. Can you hear us at all?
Yes. Just
Okay,
your
that's
face
good.
is frozen.
I'm the editor. Don't worry. I can edit all the extra stuff out. Did you hear Father's question?
Oh, no. Then no, I didn't.
Oh, no. Okay. Oh, boy.
Okay. Father, why don't you go ahead and repeat it?
How many other authors are involved in this Dignity series?
That is a good question. And, I should know the answer, but all I focused on is my book. So I know there's at least one other author.
Okay.
That's great.
All right.
Is there like
I know that there's more than 3 books. There's more than 3 books, so there will be more than just the 2 authors. So
Right.
Are these being kind of like rolled out on a schedule? So stay tuned for the next episode, stay tuned for the next installment, or are they kind of coming out simultaneously? Or
No, it's definitely a stay tuned. And my understanding is it will be the next year. So my assisted suicide book came out last year in 2024. Then they released IVF just last month here in 2025. And my understanding is the next one will come out in 2026. So a bit of a slow roll, you could say.
Yeah, fair enough.
maybe like a philosophical question then, as we're talking about the life issues. Number one, what falls in the category of the life issues? Maybe specifically for this Dignity series, but just kind of in general. I mean, in part, this is so that we can talk to our listeners about what falls into that category of the life issues. And then I'll have a follow-up to that. But first, let's just start with what are those life issues that we want to make sure that we speak to?
Yeah, so I think, how we treat the human person in general. And certainly there's, kind of, are we more narrow in our focus? Often the label of pro-life has been applied to just abortion. And then in more recent years, it has expanded to these other topics. like IVF and assisted suicide, but even people say, well, birth control, that's a topic that falls under the life issues. But then people will say, well, things even related to these topics like prenatal testing. Do we do it? If we do it, how do we respond to that info? Stuff like that. And then some people would say, well, it's even broader than that. It's matters of the death penalty. It's matters of war. And so, I mean, in a sense, all of these issues come down to, who is the human person? Are we made in God's image? How ought we be treated? And then questions related to that would be things like, are some acts inherently wrong? By their very nature, they can never be acceptable, like the issue of abortion. Are there other issues certainly related to how we, respond to and respect the dignity of persons that maybe aren't inherently wrong, like war, but instead we need to evaluate, would this be a just war? Are we using the amount of force necessary to stop an act of aggression? And the effect, kind of like the principle of double effect, is maybe some innocents will be harmed, but that's not the intention or the direct action. Whereas with abortion, you couldn't argue the death of the child is a mere effect of doing some sort of good thing, whereas the very death of the child is the nature of the attack, the nature of the act, I should say, which is an attack. But I mean, it can be very broad in terms of any of these issues ultimately involve how ought we treat one another.
Yeah. So then as we're looking at these issues, we've got, well, I guess there's a moral theology perspective where we're going to kind of speak from the perspective of what our faith teaches us, and therefore God's revelation of his law and morality. So we can examine certain things, and you're bringing up like the principle of double effect, and these terms that we'll use. Am I formally cooperating, informally cooperating? Have I maybe the unintended consequence of something else that's taking place? And so it's not, we get into like direct or indirect, all these different ways that we can parse an issue. How much nuance do we need to have in these kinds of discourses when issues are complex? And sometimes in the public square, the discussion is pretty black or white. There's not a whole lot of nuance. There's not a whole lot of room for the complicated situation. It's just sort of a blanket, either prohibition or a blanket acceptance of everything. And there can be no room for any kind of discussion.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is a need to just provide what I would say is moral clarity and to be able to explain to the public why certain things would be prohibited across the board, like the manufacturing of human persons, if we're talking specifically about IVF, and yet how some things can be morally permissible. So if we're trying to respond to the problem of infertility, can we aid the sexual act in achieving its natural end by, unblocking fallopian tubes through surgery prior to sexual activity occurring, and help people see the nuance there is we're not against science. We're not against even responding to infertility. There are ways we can do that ethically, and these are what they are, and this is why they're ethical. We're aiding the union of two people producing a third person in a private, intimate act occurring between just them, versus replacing that entirely and contracting out to a third party, the manufacturing of someone. So yes, I think we need to be able to explain all of the details and not just you can't turn it down to a tweet. A lot of these issues, they require unpacking, and not just unpacking because of the layers of ethics behind it, but even just to convey compassion and sympathy and empathy for those who are living the experiences we're speaking of. Yeah. And so we really need to be able to talk in depth.
So understanding the need to be able to talk in depth, to really articulate clearly the entire picture and everything else. Can you make it a tweet anyway? Can you boil it down to 160 characters?
So I think you can. Yes. I think you can, but inevitably what would happen when you do something like that is those who agree will say, oh, yeah, that's a great statement.
Mm,
And those who disagree, one would hope if it's crafted well enough that they would say, oh, I totally don't agree, but it would provoke them in such a way as to think more deeply, as opposed to saying, I don't agree, and then dismiss the other viewpoint entirely and not think deeper about it. So, yes, there is an art to crafting a statement, a slogan, a billboard, right? I mean, there's a whole business of advertising set around
mm,
provoking people to deeper thought, to want to consider purchasing a product or reconsidering a political viewpoint or whatever the case may be. So, yeah, I think you can do it, but we need to remember that's the starting point. That's not the ending point. That is to get people talking at length, thinking deeply, reading substantively.
So in the interest then of talking at length, um, you referred to IVF as manufacturing people. Now, that's the first time I've ever heard that phrase. But before we started recording, I said that IVF is a topic that I'm less familiar with as far as Catholic life issues go. But so this is going to be one of my this is one of my favorite questions to ask on the show. What is IVF? I like asking the what is. I like defining
Oh, I was
our
gonna be like,
terms.
so you ask everyone you interview what is IVF?
Yep. And yet I remain a novice.
So
It's a format. It's a format of a question.
right, right. Well, and it's actually a really important question because it helps put everyone on the same page when then discussing
Right.
the morality of something, is you just need to know the practical aspects of it. So, in vitro fertilization, in vitro meaning in glass, and fertilization being the conception of offspring when sperm and egg come together, more specifically, sperm fertilizing an egg. So, the two identities of sperm and egg ceasing to exist, and then an actual, instead of human parts, a whole human coming into existence in the form of offspring of the parents as an embryo, a one-celled zygote, but the next generation, the genetic material of the genetic father and the genetic mother. So IVF is basically, a reproductive technologist collecting eggs where a woman typically has super ovulation occur, where she's given an injection so that instead of releasing one egg in a monthly cycle, her body could release 10, 15, 20 eggs. Those are then extracted in a medical setting. Then you need sperm. That is typically collected via an act of masturbation. Technically, a couple could engage in sex with a perforated condom, and then the semen that was collected taken or it doesn't even have to be perforated, but taken to a lab. But most often it is through the sin of masturbation.
Mm-hmm.
So then the sperm is collected, the eggs are collected, and then they are put together in one of two ways. You could either have the sperm put into a glass dish with an egg, and you see, or multiple eggs, and you see which ones come into existence. Or you can have a procedure called ICSI, where one sperm is selected by the scientist to inject into one egg, and they are very much determining this is going to be the next offspring. At that point, once you have fertilization successfully occurring in glass, the IVF, practitioner, there's many different levels of people who work in the clinics, but they would then typically test the embryo genetically for any major anomalies that typically occurs, although a couple could deny it if they so wanted to. And then at that point, if the embryo is considered to be viable and of good quality, that embryo would then be inserted into a woman's body. And I specifically say a woman and not, or generally say a woman and not specifically the mother, because it's possible with IVF you could have surrogacy where a woman who is not the genetic mother, who has not had her eggs used for the conception of the child, be the one who would gestate the child. And insertion does not mean the child will come to birth. The question then becomes, now the embryo's inner body, will it attach in her uterus? If that occurs, you have implantation. If that occurs, you wait to see if the baby will make it to birth. A lot of babies are miscarried through IVF, but it's possible they could make it to birth. And then if you do, you have what's considered to be a successful IVF cycle.
Mm-hmm. it's almost difficult to hear you talk about it. I don't know if this is a common experience people have, but here's what I'm trying to say. I think that IVF is often put like in the general public in a positive light, and when you just use the language that actually describes it, it's like, oh man, that's like there's a certain amount of like frigidity to it that I think lends itself to the Catholic understanding of what IVF is. Do you think that's accurate?
Yes. Well, yeah, and that's why earlier on I used, and throughout the book I talk about this, use the phrase the manufacturing of human persons.
Yeah.
Because that kind of even just description, it's not even like I'm making it more dramatic than it is. I mean, that's just literally what happens. And it naturally hits us where we're like, oh, that sounds like manufacturing. One of the questions I ask in my book is, why is slavery wrong? And someone might think like, why would that question even be related to IVF? Well, obviously slavery is very different, but the question, why is slavery wrong, is getting us to make the acknowledgement, which we already all intuitively know, unless we're a slave owner, to make the acknowledgement that slavery is wrong because it treats the human person as an object instead of a subject. As something I can own or possess and therefore discard or destroy if I don't want it. And that's how we treat objects. And that's okay for objects, right? Like if you have a tattered bedspread that, really isn't doing the job keeping you warm, or, it's got holes and rips and baby puke all over it, then you're going to get rid of the object. But if underneath the bedspread is your baby is a subject. You're not just going to dispose of a human person the way you would dispose of an object. You're not going to manufacture a human person, or you ought not, the way you would manufacture objects. And so that's, I think, what we need to get at with IVF, is to show that even if the desire for a child is very good and very normal, and we can talk more about that, is what we're doing ordered to the nature of who the child is. And if slavery ought to be rejected because it dehumanizes the human person, treating them as an object instead of a subject, is it possible that the manufacturing of a human person also dehumanizes them because it treats the person as an object instead of a subject, bringing someone into existence in a way like we would manufacture a car, except the person is different from a car?
Right. Yeah, and I said frigidity, but maybe a better word would have been sterility. Right, it feels very.
No pun intended.
No pun intended, of course. Because it's so scientific, and I suppose you could speak about the marital act that way. And if someone did speak about the marital act that way, I mean, I'm speaking from personal experience. If someone came up to me and, for some reason felt that they should unload all of that information on me on the street, it would be a turnoff from them, that's for sure. But also from like a true understanding of what the marital act is. It would make it sound robotic.
Right.
And the thing is, when you're describing IVF, it makes it sound robotic, but it is robotic almost.
Right.
Right. So I think that I guess what I'm trying to say is I wasn't trying to insult your description. I was trying to just I was just trying to editorialize, I suppose. Right.
Well, it's the very nature of indeed IVF.
Right.
But if we think about the marital act, one of the ways we often describe it in Catholic circles, of course, is a communion of persons. That it is a coming together of, two becoming one, but reflecting the love of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. It's Trinitarian, it's giving, it's receiving. We are made for a communion of persons. And the very beginning of one's life, I would argue, ought to also be as a communion of persons, that the child should come into existence beneath the mother's heart, not in, at the hands of a stranger, in a glass dish. And so we see that with IVF, you actually have a breaking apart of persons, a separating and a dividing. When the woman's eggs are harvested, if it happens to be the eggs and sperm are collected from a husband and wife, and again, as I mentioned, that's not always the case if people are hiring surrogates and so forth. But let's say it is a married couple that want to use the gametes of each. As nice as it might be for the husband to be there when the woman's eggs are being extracted, I mean, I think you're awake for that, but there's probably a degree of, anyways, regardless, as much as it'd be nice for him to be there holding her hand, his presence is not necessary. Her eggs can be extracted without him there. As I mentioned, a couple could choose to obtain a sperm sample through sexual intimacy, but that's not how it's done. I mean, men are given,
Right.
a cup and told to go into a room at the IVF clinic. There is pornography accessible. You can bring in your own device. You can use the plethora of porn options they provide there. I mean, there's a dark underworld to this.
Right, right.
But, could the woman be present when the sperm sample is obtained? Yes, but is her presence necessary? No, it's not. So once again, we're separating, we're dividing, we're fracturing. Could the parents go to the lab the day the sperm and egg will be put together in a petri dish? They could. I don't think they do. But again, their presence isn't necessary for the IVF specialist to be able to execute the task of bringing the sperm and egg together. So I say all of that in order to make the point. Whereas sexual intimacy and then the creation of the child in the mother's body, all of that comes about through a union and communion, a continual coming together and a being together. With IVF, everything is divided, fractured, and separated. You don't need anyone to be together. That matters.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of those issues that seems to me to have there's an element, of course, we can talk about our moral theology and the Catholic teaching and the Catholic understanding of the human person. But this seems to me to be something that can be understood even absent a perspective that comes from Christian faith. This seems to me to be the kind of an issue that should be able to be understood just at a biomedical, philosophical level. You need not necessarily understand Revelation or what Jesus teaches about the human person in the gospel or anything else. If you understand ethics and you can reason logically about medical ethics in particular, then we should be able to come to an understanding about what this really is. And so as you're writing about this and as you think about it and as you try to articulate the positions, one thing that I've noticed so far is we really haven't gotten very much into moral theology. We haven't really talked that much about what the gospel says. And I'm always happy to talk about what the gospel says, but this actually, I think, is kind of the point, is that what the church is teaching here is not just some religious fanaticism, but what the church is teaching is actually just natural law. This is who we are as human beings. And so we're not articulating a position that is exclusively a religious position. We're trying to articulate something that actually resonates with who the human person is, regardless of religion, regardless of faith background or particular creed or anything else. What do you find, Stephanie, is the general response to this? Are you finding people who are just like, really, what convinced me was the moral theology, or that people are actually being exposed maybe for the first time to some ethical reasoning techniques that they've not noticed before?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a great observation, Father. And yes, I would say that people are pausing to say, oh, I'd never actually heard it quite that way, especially the language of manufacture. I hadn't thought of it that way. And so without necessarily diving into a big religious argument, which we can and should do, there's a time and place for it. I mean, this is a Word on Fire, a Catholic publisher. I obviously make overt, not only religious references, but Catholic references. But I wanted to also craft an argument that would appeal, first of all, to Christians who are not Catholic, because the pursuit of IVF certainly happens amongst people who identify as Catholics, but also increasingly it happens amongst people who would just be Protestants, evangelical Christians who just think, look, as long as it's the husband's sperm and the wife's egg, God said, be fruitful and multiply. Shouldn't we have offspring this way if we can't the traditional way? So there's a need for that basic formation. But then I got thinking, even if someone's not Christian, even if they're not religious, from a natural law perspective, can we appeal to a truth written on the heart? And so that's where, yes, I think the question of why is slavery wrong, to get us thinking about objects versus subjects, how we ought to treat subjects differently from objects is important. Another point I wanted to make, and that's kind of how I wrote the book, was I started with the low-hanging fruit, the easiest argument I thought people could accept if they weren't religious. And so one of the points I make is, if we go back to the point I made earlier that a woman may have 10, 15, or 20 eggs extracted, you get way more sperm in one sperm sample, which means therefore all 10, 15, or 20 eggs will be fertilized. But you're not going to have a woman have 10, 15, or 20 embryos inserted into her body. So one of my first points is to get people thinking, what happens if you get 20 eggs extracted and 20 eggs, let's say 15 fertilized, let's say 5 of them don't even fertilize. So let's say you get 15 embryos. We have to pause and ask ourselves, what are going to happen to those 15 people? These are human persons. They're younger than us. I mean, this is where we also slightly wade into the abortion debate, because then we have to help people see scientifically life begins at fertilization. But once we do that and help people see life begins there, then we have to get people thinking, okay, what is the ethical way of treating these 15 people? And if only 1 or 2 embryos will be inserted into the woman's body, which is typically the case, because if you insert a lot and all of them implant, then you get a multiples pregnancy. You could get triplets, because also one human can split into 2 and make identical twins. So if you insert 1 embryo, you actually might get twins. You might get 2 because they could split into 2. So if you insert 2 embryos and each of those split into 2, you could get 4. If you insert 4 and they become identical twins, then you've got 8. So it's way too dangerous to insert too many embryos. So if you have 15 embryos created and let's say 2 are inserted, you're left with 13 human beings. What are we doing to those human beings? Well, if they're subjected to genetic testing, and of the 13, let's say 8 are determined to have bad genetics, not be given a good grade because they're often letter graded, kind of like an essay. This is an A- embryo. This is a C+ embryo. You can see this in the literature, but even a friend of mine's sister-in-law pursued IVF. She talked about, yeah, we have 1 embryo left. It's a C-. So, we don't know if we'll go back for it. I mean, again, this is not the language we would use when talking about human persons, and yet it is the language being used when talking about human persons. So right there, we can see a dehumanizing aspect to this. But the point is, if you say, okay, 8 of these 13 embryos aren't even worth inserting, then they're going to be destroyed. So that's killing. So that means 8 human beings are being killed. So what about the other 5? Well, we're going to put them in the freezer. Well, then the question becomes, for how long? Will we ever take them out? And what is freezing going to do to them? Not every embryo frozen when thawed and inserted will survive the freeze-thaw process. So we're endangering their lives even by putting them in freezers. And then beyond that, there's even the putting them in a situation where they are not naturally developing according to their nature. So an embryo frozen then for 10 years and inserted 10 years later, and successfully going through the pregnancy and being born 9 months later, that child at birth should have peers who are actually 10 years old. And so the whole life trajectory and life experience of that newborn child, who's technically been in existence on Earth for 10 years, not 9 months in the womb, there's an injustice there. This child has not been allowed to develop according to her nature and have the experiences that would naturally be in accord with the nature. So I start the book just talking about the killing, the prenatal, the testing, the genetic testing, which has a very eugenics mentality, just to get the average person who's not religious to say, that doesn't sit right with me.
It seems so often, whenever I think about this, and I remember this from 20 years ago, taking a biomedical ethics class as a philosophy major. And it just strikes me that this is an example of technology far outpacing our moral reasoning and our ethical thought process and our even just thinking about consequences. Like, it seems like a technology was developed. Like, we figured out we can do these things. And there's something, all right, if we put aside the particulars for just a second and think that we can develop technology that can do incredible things, there's something very beautiful, right? And if we were talking about being able to manipulate, I don't know, cells of a leaf so that we could make more leaves, we would just think this is really cool. How interesting that we can do this. And it's a scientific way of doing agriculture. And that's it. It's nothing more. And in that way, we might say there's not that much to say morally about it. But then we apply that same technology, that same thinking to the human person, and we go, oh wow, we can do this too. And then nobody bothers to say, should we? I mean, this is
Right.
Jurassic Park, right? That was the whole thing that I think it's Jeff Goldblum has that great line. Nobody bothered to ask, should we? They
Yeah.
just realized that they could, and so they did it. And the consequences are very real. So there's the beauty of being able to do these scientific things, but
Mhm.
then there's the absence of the what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, just foresight, like failing to see ahead of the downstream effects of this and what that will mean, and therefore the moral reasoning that we have to get into. Um, yeah, so that's just more of a statement. All right, let me ask this
There,
question, because if we talk about motivations and the reasons
there
why
was a
people
slight.
pursue this, um, I look at this and I think there are people who genuinely, and you alluded to this before, Stephanie. There's people who genuinely want to have a child, and their thinking is, God tells us, be fruitful and multiply. Human life is a good, and we're having trouble conceiving naturally. We're having trouble conceiving by the traditional method, if you will. This is a technological option for us then. And they're not thinking in terms of everything that you've just described. They're not thinking about what the scientific process, which the chemistry experiment almost that it is. They're not thinking in terms of the commodification of human life. They're thinking, I want a baby, and I think that human life is beautiful. So they're starting from a very good place, and even I think we can even say from a very holy place. They're just arriving at a decision or a position that ends up being very flawed and in need of something. How do we communicate in that context? How do we speak into that reality?
Yeah, great question. Um, well, we speak into it by really acknowledging what you just did, which is it's good and it's holy to want children. God said, be fruitful and multiply. The first command he gave us was to be fruitful and multiply. So we need to acknowledge that that is a good, and that's why at the start of my book I actually share the stories of various friends of mine who allowed me to interview them for the book, who had a difficult time conceiving, some of whom never conceived, others ultimately did successfully conceive. But I share a variety of different stories in order to acknowledge the heavy cross that the inability to have offspring is, that it is a terrible suffering for people. And then one of the things I do also early on in the book is make an analogy to another good or holy desire, and that is for a spouse. And I actually provide a very brief little, you could call case study on the situation in China, because there were decades of a one-child policy
Hmm.
in a culture that preferred male children to female children. We now have a profound male female imbalance in the country of China, where you have, I think it's at least 35 million more men than women. And just
Wow.
to kind of put that in perspective, I live in the States now, but I'm originally from Canada. The population of Canada is about 35 to 40 million. So imagine the whole population of Canada just being men.
Wow.
That is the amount of more men than there is women in that country. What does that mean? That means there are a lot of men who will never find wives, who will never get married. And we have to acknowledge that that is a profound tragedy and suffering, which has come from an immoral choice to limit the number of children people could have. And then when you do that, also prefer one sex over the other. So those choices and those preferences have led to these terrible consequences. But I bring this up in order to make the point, as much as we need to acknowledge the suffering that the man in China who desires a wife, who will never get a wife, is going through. We need to acknowledge that. And as someone who didn't get married and find the love of her life until she was 40, I know that ache of yearning for a life's partner. I'm the number of times I journaled to Jesus, you yourself wrote, it's not good for man to be alone, and I would pointedly say to God, like, I feel alone. Where's my life's companion? I came to a realization, and I write this in the book in one of my chapters about idols, and this is where I do get overtly religious, is I realized, and through excellent spiritual direction and guidance, as much as my desire for a spouse was good, as much as the desire for a Chinese man's spouse is good, we actually don't have a right to a spouse. A spouse is a person, a subject and not an object. So we are gifts to be given and received, but we are not to be possessed. And so as much as the desire for a spouse is good, and, going on a setup, doing speed dating, even online dating if it's successful, although it was never successful for me. The point is, there are some things you can do, but human trafficking isn't one of them. As much as you want a spouse, you cannot traffic a spouse. But then what I write in my book about is a big problem in China where women are being trafficked within China. They're being brought in from other countries like Vietnam and Cambodia. They're being forced into marriages against their will. The desire for a wife was good, but the pursuit of human trafficking to get that wife, not good. And so then I analogize that to say, in the same way, the desire for offspring is good. And pursuing that through adoption, pursuing that through correcting underlying infertility at the physiological level in the woman or the man, that's good. But kidnapping, that's not good. You can't kidnap someone else's child in order to fulfill your child for offspring. So then I present the question of, which is IVF more like? Is it more like the unethical means of kidnapping to achieve a child? Not saying the person who pursues IVF is like a kidnapper, but getting across the point that the action itself is inherently wrong, even if the desire for offspring is good.
I think what I've always kind of come to is ultimately IVF can become sort of like, I am entitled to have a child. I have a right to have a child, and therefore I can pay for one to be made for me. And there's something about that just is
dark.
It's very dark, but I can also understand the desire being something that people feel overwhelms every other consideration. And I think so much of that comes out of a culture that says, if this is what you really want, then you should have it. That doesn't accept that we have limitations or that things are impossible, that in the you can be anything you want to be sort of era, right? Just if you can dream it, you can do it. Then if I can imagine having a child, then I should be able to have one by whatever means are required. But ultimately that really gets in the way of seeing the gift. And maybe that's where biomedical ethics and the philosophical, logical reasoning that is necessary will kind of fall short, because that ends up, biomedical ethics and logical reasoning can often become sort of sterile in tone, right? And this is where the theology actually comes in as something so beautiful, because we're speaking now about the dignity of human life, created in the image and likeness of God, loved from all eternity by God. And so understanding the human person in that context of love and relationality gives us a different way of seeing it.
Yeah, absolutely. There has to be, again, it's this balancing act, because you want to be sensitive for those who struggle to fulfill this good desire, while at the same time helping people remember our ultimate goal is heaven. Our ultimate goal isn't getting married. It's not having children. It's getting to heaven. And for a good majority of people, the pathway to holiness and ultimately getting to heaven is going to be through marriage and through motherhood and fatherhood. But it might not be that way for some people, and you might get married but not have children. But ultimately we're called to a spiritual motherhood and a spiritual fatherhood that for some people, and a lot of people, will also be manifested in a physical motherhood or fatherhood, but that there are still ways to be fulfilled as a human person, and particularly as a mother, and the maternal instinct built into every female and a male, and the paternal instinct built into every man, that can be manifested perhaps differently than one thought, but helping people realize, we can try to make heaven on earth, but it's not going to be heaven until we're out of earth. There's always going to be suffering. And, when I got married at 40, I mean, I say I'm married to a saint. I might have said this on the last show. I mean, I really am. Almost 5 years in, I still say I'm married to a saint.
We want to meet him because he seems like a great guy. And
yes.
Yeah. I would like to meet a saint. So,
He really is. But it's not that the last 5 years have been bliss. We have lost 4 babies, 4 out of our 6. The majority of our children we've lost through miscarriage. And, could we get pregnant again? I hope so. But I also live with the simultaneous fear amongst that great desire of another miscarriage, which I don't want. But I desire a child. Am I willing to go down the possible path of suffering in order to get something that is not suffering? But even there can still be suffering, right? You become a parent and you realize there's a lot of things you can't do just day to day once you're a parent that can be hard and can feel like a slog. Then there's real overt suffering in parenthood, like a friend of mine whose child just died in the last 2 years from terrible cancer when he was like 6 years old. So there is always going to be an element of suffering to our life story. For those who can't have children, that is their suffering right now. When you have children, that suffering's going to look different. It will still be there. It's not that we, embrace suffering as some sort of good, but we acknowledge it as a part of this imperfect experience in this imperfect world, remembering we're pilgrims on a journey. This isn't where we're ultimately meant to be.
Yeah. Can I just tangent for a second here? Stephanie, I really appreciate that you're able to speak that way and so honestly and vulnerably just about your own experience with miscarriage. It's something that I'm increasingly grateful that women are able to speak about, because it is a very, very real pain that they suffer. And of course they are excited about having a child. This is a gift. They recognize that gift. But so often they have found historically, like, there's no place for them to really talk about it. And more women are sharing that story and that element of their lives and that experience. And I think it's so important, because the more that the word is out there, it's okay to talk about this, the healthier it is. Women are able to process that so much better. And it's important. And I'm grateful that you're able to speak about this, and that you're able to speak about that experience from your own perspective, while also saying, having had these experiences, I still wouldn't choose this. I know what this is from the inside. And I'm holding out hope, and I'm holding out that hope also for you. If you're somebody struggling with infertility or struggling with miscarriage, it's really beautiful. So thank you for just bringing that here.
Well, you're welcome, Father. And yeah, one of the things I've realized when I've looked at the stats, because I didn't get married till 40 and have my first child at 41. Well, technically my first baby I miscarried, so I was pregnant at 40, but then my first live birth at 41. The stats are such that once you turn 40, your rate of miscarriage is almost 50%. And at this point, I'm almost 45, so my miscarriage risk is potentially even higher than 50%. And so some people would say, you are a perfect candidate for IVF because you need to subject your eggs and embryos to quality testing. So if you did IVF, your eggs would be extracted, and we could see whether they're, maybe the vast majority of my miscarriages, if not all of them, were chromosomal abnormalities. So if I just subjected my eggs and then subsequent embryos created in a lab to testing, then I could decrease the odds of losing life. And my response would be, I'm not going to go against the nature of what it means to be loved and created in a loving relationship and manufacture offspring just so I don't go through the possible heartache of miscarriage. So yes, as you say, to be able to have that lived experience to say, but I'm still not going to choose this. I'm still going to go down the path of the unknown. And that's also the nature of life being created through sexual intimacy as opposed to IVF. There's that forcing aspect with IVF. There's a hands in the air letting go with
Yeah.
receiving life through sexual intimacy. Yes, in the world of natural family planning, we can know fertility way better than we once did. So we can know when the odds are very high that someone would conceive, but we still
Yeah.
have no guarantee. And even when that sexual act occurs at a time of peak fertility, we have no idea which egg was released that month. We have no idea of, let's say, even the multiple sexual acts that occur leading up to or just after the day of peak fertility, which in one sperm of the millions is actually going to fertilize that egg. And then once that occurs, how long the child will live, whether for the duration of a pregnancy, for a good long life until 90 or somewhere in between. So there's still a receptivity at, Lord, if this is your will, whatever your will, thy will be done. Whereas there's just a making, a forcing, as I've said, a manufacturing in the other method.
Can I ask a stupid question then? So if they're talking about IVF and once you're past 40, this would be the option that's recommended for you, so that they can subject the embryos to testing and to examination and to grading. We can give this an A grade or a C- grade, whatever it is. Matt, by the way, I think you're an A+ person, so way to go, buddy.
Thanks.
But like we've got these. If that's possible, I clearly don't understand what happens in miscarriage then, because it seems like I didn't realize that it was all about the embryo. I thought that there was something else. Like, so I don't.
You mean
I guess
something
I
wrong
just.
with the woman?
Well, I don't want to say it that way. That seems really mean. I'm trying to be
But
nice.
you mean
and
with her
pastoral.
body?
Yeah, like I'm thinking, like I didn't.
Leave it to me to just.
Yeah, you can say that. I can't say that.
Yeah.
Like, but I thought that there was, let's say, more factors than just what grade the embryo would get.
Yes.
I
So
thought there
good
were
point.
additional factors, right?
Yes. So I'm glad you brought that up because there are additional factors. There's multiple factors. So egg quality and therefore, the embryo, him or herself, wants that particular egg, or even sperm quality. You might have sperm that kind of aren't considered optimal. But when a particular sperm and egg come together, is that embryo have a chromosomal abnormality that allows the embryo to continue growing and developing, or that would cause the embryo to die very early? That can be a high number of miscarriages, but certainly not all reason for miscarriage. So another reason could be that you have low progesterone, which I have been found to have. Now, the simple fix for that is you just take progesterone. It's a simple pill that your doctor prescribes to you. There's 3 ways it can be taken: orally, vaginally, or by an injection into the butt cheek. And having a certain dose of progesterone in the body. Progesterone means, you can think of it as progestate. So it is helping the baby gestate and grow in the uterus. But in my case, 3 out of my 4 miscarriages, I was on progesterone. So even in my case, getting me up to the optimal level of progesterone still wasn't enough to keep my babies alive. Then you could have things like uterine fibroids, which are growths in the uterus that, as the embryo implants, might get in the way either at implantation or the early growth of the embryo. Again, in my case, I was cleared for that big uterine examination, and nothing of that was in there. So for some people, yes, there could be a physiological reason, either at a hormonal level or at a structural level, either with the uterus itself or with the fallopian tubes. Maybe there's a blockage I kind of alluded to earlier, but the fix for that could be a surgery where you unblock the fallopian tube. So instead of doing IVF, you at least try the surgery. There's no guarantee with any of this that you'll ultimately have a live birth at the end. But it's possible, if you unblock the fallopian tubes, that sperm will travel more easily up, and then embryos will travel more easily down. So there can be multiple factors, yes. But certainly a chromosomal abnormality is sometimes the case for miscarriage.
Okay.
But because also we never subjected any of our embryos that we lost to testing. We could have, but we chose not to because it wouldn't have changed our openness to life. So, and if it couldn't be fixed, then we're like, well, we'll still have babies, and come what may, God's will be done.
Yeah.
So can I ask a question that will reveal just how little I know? That's my way of saying a stupid question.
Hey man, we're in the same boat here. This is great.
Yeah. Because you're talking about how, okay, like let's say it would be totally morally licit to get a procedure that unblocks a fallopian tube, right? Is it morally acceptable to have and here's where my not knowing comes in, to receive a procedure that would say this particular egg is likely to produce a healthy child at birth, whereas this one isn't, and say they remove a particular egg and they keep a particular egg, and it doesn't interact with like the marital act, like you know what I mean? The conception of the child happens the way it should, right? But it's a procedure that says, I don't know, that makes it more possible, just in the same way that a procedure to clear a fallopian tube would, and the conception of the child is not in vitro, right? It's in the body through the marital act, right? Is that something? I mean, the reason that this is revealing how little I know is because I don't know if this is a real procedure, right? I'm basically throwing a thought experiment out there because it seems to me one of the answers to in vitro fertilization is also better care, like more
Matt
care
basically,
that is better and more in line with natural law.
Yeah, Matt wants to know, when a woman lays eggs, where do they go?
That's not what I'm saying. Just to be clear, I have a son.
And another one on the way.
And he did not come out of an egg. Well.
Good question. So there are some variation of procedures where they try to make conception happen in the body, where the eggs can be extracted, the sperm obtained through a perforated condom through sexual intimacy, and then they're put in a little tube with an air bubble and then inserted back into the body to increase their proximity, but still have them conceived in the body, conception in the body. That doesn't sit right with me because it seems too much like involving a third party external to the marital covenant in the start or beginning of someone's life. And that you might start through sexual intimacy, but you're holding back, if it's a perforated condom, you're holding back some of your seed to give it to a third party. And then even the egg, like if you're just talking about, well, let's take an egg, let's test it. If it's a good egg, we'll insert it back in and then tell the couple to go have intimacy and then maybe. But what if it's a bad egg? So then is it almost kind of contraceptive that month? Because if it's a bad egg, are we not inserting it back in, which means she's got
That's
no chance of getting pregnant that month? And then are we too much? And even what is our definition of a good egg or a bad egg? Is it just the ability to not have an anomaly so serious that you would die before birth? But what if it's so there's just so many factors that I think would put us in a situation where we're playing God and we're manufacturing, even to a degree. Whereas in these other situations, when you're taking progesterone, when you're unblocking a fallopian tube, when you are doing a surgery for PCOS, where the skin around the ovary becomes so leathery that it's hard for eggs to release. So basically an egg is never getting out for the sperm to fertilize. You can do what's called a wedge resection, where a wedge is basically cut out of the ovary to stretch the skin so that the egg can get released. In that situation, you're basically restoring the body back to its normal functioning, and then come what may, whatever egg, you're not picking the egg that's going to be released that month.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's just that I'm trying to attempt to steel man it. I mean, I'm not much of a philosopher nor an apologist, so my steel man is more like it's like a slab of wood. But like as far as it being potentially contraceptive, I definitely see that point. But I would argue that like it's not immoral for a man and his wife to engage in a sexual act during a time that, say, they're practicing NFP and they know that,
Right.
it's virtually impossible. You know what I mean? So how would one balance that, knowing
So
that?
the difference would be if they engage in sexual intimacy when there is no egg present because her body has already released the egg and it
Right.
died.
It's still natural.
It's and the key maybe isn't so much natural, but it's that the infertility at that point of her cycle is in accord with where her body should be functioning. We
Right,
only
I
actually
see.
should be have an egg that lives for 24 hours, and sperm that can live for up to 5 days within the body of the woman. Whereas in this other case, the egg was there and we removed it. So in the case of having sex when there's no egg, well, there's no egg. In the other
Right.
case, if we're removing the egg and may or may not return it, depending on how we,
Right.
yeah.
It's
That's-
an active contraception in that case.
Yeah, whether we obviously the person who's trying to get pregnant would say, "Are you kidding? I'm not contracepting. I want to get pregnant." But then there's
Right.
still that element of if things are, under certain conditions with
Yeah.
the, quote unquote quality of the egg. And so this is where again, and I think the loss of my children has helped me realize this, long life isn't even our goal. Our goal is heaven. I hope my children outlive me. I don't want to bury any more children. And certainly the more time you spend with someone, the thought of losing them is even more heartbreaking, right? So if either of my older children, I'm to lose them, I've had longer to even bond with them, right? So I don't want to ever envision having to bury them. But at the end of the day, the goal is not length of life. The goal is heaven. And so are we willing on our journey to heaven to accept the different crosses and sufferings that will come our way? And that might be through not being able to have a spouse or a child or the death of a child or illness and so forth. So yes, and in the case of anything gone wrong, we can try to fix it. That's why we have medicine. That's why Jesus,
Right.
Gave sight to the blind and took away Peter's mother-in-law who had a fever, took away her fever, and cured people who had leprosy. These were all things that went wrong with the body, and he restored them to proper functioning. So that in the same way, we can say, okay, well, if Jesus believed in, I have a whole chapter in my book called Shalom, which is really a right orderedness to every aspect of our life. It's yes, people would greet each other in the time of Christ and say shalom, shalom, peace be with you. But it's so much more than just an expression of peace. It's this wholeness. It's this unity, how we were made to be physically and emotionally and spiritually. So where things are not in shalom, we can try to restore them, but with the understanding that we're not going to be able to do that perfectly, because we're yet to be in that perfect world.
So in the interest of bouncing off that wholeness, right? I could see, I'm going to draw an analogy. Someone who is born outside of wedlock has been born from a situation that was not in the intended way.
Yeah.
Now, the Catholic Church would say that person still has dignity. In the same way, someone who is born via the process of an in vitro fertilization is born in a way like that the Catholic Church clearly condemns this act as sinful and says it's against nature. So how does one, well, I don't know. I don't even know how to phrase the question because I believe they have dignity. You know what I mean? Yeah. But how does one maintain that dignity?
No, you're going in absolutely the right direction here. I was thinking exactly the same thing, that it's great for us to be able to talk about the ethical consequences and implications of a particular procedure from that biomedical ethics standpoint, from moral theology. But we also have to be able to confront the reality that this is a thing that is happening. It's not something that could happen, and this is why it would be wrong or unethical or immoral. This is something that is happening, and we all know children born of IVF. All of us have encountered that, whether we are aware of it or not. There are children born of IVF all over, and they are loved infinitely by God. They have an innate, inherent unrepeatable dignity before the Lord. They are worthy of our respect and our honor. And the choices of their parents do not in any way diminish that goodness, that reality. You know.
Yes. And oh, go ahead, Father.
Well, I was just going to say that I think because we do have to speak to some of these more challenging realities regarding morality, regarding the procedure itself, there's a temptation to think that because this procedure is not right, therefore we also condemn children that are the fruit of it. And I think we've just got, this is maybe something that you're talking about in your book. I don't know. I haven't had a chance yet to see it, Stephanie, but that there's a distinction between the sin that took place and the person that is the result. That the person who results has no guilt. There's nothing wrong with them. They're good, and God wants to bless them. But that can be a hard message to communicate when.
And I think especially the idea that God wanted them in existence. Do you know what I mean? God desired them to exist. That I don't know. Maybe I'm off base, but I think that
no. There's
that
a wrestling match that
would
has
be a
to
hurdle.
happen there. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought up. Yes, I absolutely address in the book. And one of the points I make is if you have 4 human beings and one was conceived in an act of love on their parents' wedding night, one was conceived as a result of a hookup on a college campus, one was conceived in violence of rape, and one was conceived through technology and IVF. All 4 are equal in dignity. Back to this whole idea of the dignity series. All 4 are equal in dignity and value. They're made in God's image and willed by God. But we would never say there's equality in the 4 ways those individuals were conceived. Even if someone has no moral qualms about a hookup, certainly they would have moral qualms about rape. So they can at least acknowledge, well, that method of conception, is immoral and is wrong. And what we want to be able to say, and this is again where faith gets injected, is people of faith, we're able to say, God is so amazing that he can take bad, he can take sin, he can take profound evils and bring good from it. It doesn't make the sin not sin. It doesn't make the evil good. It makes God good. It makes him amazing and powerful with this ability to redeem, right? We're a week away from the Easter Vigil where we'll have the Exultet, right? Oh, happy fault. The sin of Adam, which led to such a great Redeemer. And so we see that, and it is important to make this point because, when every time I speak now and this issue comes up, if I'm not overtly speaking on IVF and I'm speaking on abortion and someone asks about IVF, I acknowledge the dignity of the person conceived that way, expecting there are people in my audience conceived that way. And I don't want them to hear IVF is immoral, therefore I'm immoral. IVF is bad, therefore I'm bad. God can bring good out of bad. I mean, in a very simple way, illustrated this for one of my children the other day. She fell asleep in the car. She's fully potty trained, but she fell asleep and she's not potty trained for sleep. And so I thought, oh shoot, I'm transferring her. She doesn't have a pull-up on. So I put like one of those like Chuck's pads under her to like catch if she peed. Sure enough, when she woke up, she peed. So she was all wet, but the Chuck's pad did its job. However, I was a little worried that a little bit might've gone on the couch. So I go to clean her up. I go back to the couch and I pull the couch cushion back, and lo and behold, this tiny little kid ring that she loved, that she lost months ago and has talked about and never been able to find, was hiding it wedged in between the couch cushions. And so it was because of the accident, because of the, oh shoot, you wet yourself here, that it led to this wonderful revelation of there's your ring we've been wanting. And so I was able to demonstrate, oh, even when things don't happen, the way we want, and we can say, oh shoot, it's an oh shoot moment. It's like, but look, something good can come out of it. And so in the same way, it's like, yeah, there's lots of oh shoot moments, like this shouldn't have happened. But God says, well, you're going to use your human freedom to choose this. So I'm going to use my divine will and draw good out of it. And I will conceive this child and I will conceive that child. So we don't have the ability to go and undo the past. So because we can't undo the past, we work with the present, and therefore in our present moment are good people made in God's image. but how they were conceived was not good and can never be considered good.
Mhm. So help me out as a pastor, short of telling everybody to, or handing a copy of your dignity books to parishioners as they leave the church and telling them that it's their assigned reading for the week.
That's not a bad idea.
It's not a bad idea. Right?
Word on Fire would appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
If I keep bringing it up throughout this episode, do I get commission or?
And I guess there's the challenge of like, all right, you get to go and give a talk about this, and you're aware that the people in your audience will be perhaps the children of IVF, or will have practiced this or something, but they've also made a choice to come to your talk about this topic, and so they kind of know what they're getting into as they go in. Something that parish priests face all the time is the criticism. Why don't you talk more about these big issues? And I'm like, do you realize how many children I have at Mass? And some of these issues are simply not age appropriate for young children to hear about. I can't be the guy who gets up there and talks about this stuff, because parents, it's not that they're not willing to hear the truth. They are very willing to hear the truth, but there are certain truths that children don't need to hear yet. There are certain ways to speak about this that it makes it really hard to try to preach about in the context of a Sunday Mass, like at a normal parish setting. Additionally, just in the ordinary course of pastoral care, you're going to have folks who are unaware that this is a problem, who don't realize that this is something that they should not be doing, and who have been essentially told by all of their medical professionals, every advisor that they have on the medical front tells them that this is a perfectly fine and safe thing to do. And I mean, I've talked to some folks who have gone through this, and the descriptions that they give of, especially for the women, the descriptions that they give of the process sounds so horribly painful, traumatic even. And I'm saying that without any firsthand knowledge. But to hear about the hope, the disappointment, the physical toll of the injections that are required, all this stuff, I think to myself, I can't imagine anyone wanting to subject themselves to that at a great financial cost also.
Right.
But people want this. And so how best to pastorally accompany and help them to understand what it is that we believe, what the church teaches, what is morally and biomedically ethical, how best to communicate to them these realities, while also, man, just meeting them right there in that place of pain and disappointment, but also without ever telling them you're doing a great thing, because I can't possibly say you're doing a great thing. Even though I want them to know that I love them and I'm here for them as a spiritual father and as a pastor.
Right.
And then, of course, I just can't get up and say that from the pulpit too much, because you talk about this and then the kids are asking mom and dad uncomfortable questions, and I don't want to be the cause of that.
So, a few thoughts. I mean, it's kind of like we were talking at the very beginning. Can you tweet this out? Can you, in just a few characters, kind of make a point? And I said, well, I think you can, but it's going to lead to so much more. So I think it is possible to preach on it in a carefully crafted way that for those for whom it's relevant, it therefore leads to more, where you're having pastoral encounters afterwards in the office, where talks are being held in more depth later that week, and more people will now come because Father Sam, talked about it and didn't just advertise the event, but gave us some food for thought, from the pulpit. And I think, we were joking, first hand out this book to all your people. But what you could also do is follow the recipe of the book. So the recipe is, you begin with acknowledging the cross of infertility, and you share stories. You could even share a story from the book. And then you talk about good desires not always being allowed to be achieved if the way to achieve them is a bad means. And you make some simple analogies. And then you can give a kind of general overview of thinking beyond stage one. My husband's an economist, and in econ, he's taught me you have to think beyond stage one. People come up with an idea and be like, this is a great idea. And then, but when you start asking questions, you think, but if you do that, then what's going to happen and what's going to happen? And you start to realize, oh, that's not a good idea after all. So what began as this is a way for married couples to conceive children, we have to think beyond stage one. Even though it's morally objectionable for even married couples to do it for reasons we've talked about. One of the things I was just saying to my husband the other day as a result of a news article I was reading, if you are in the business of human trafficking, hello, IVF. Like there are stories now coming out about like certain men who hire surrogates, hire egg sellers, and I call them sellers and not donors because at least in countries like the US, you can get paid a hefty amount of money to give up your eggs. But you could have a creeper, get an egg seller, get a surrogate, and then go through the legal paperwork. And the moment the baby comes out of the surrogate, it doesn't go into her arms, it goes into the creeper's arms. And he now has, and imagine then if you're in a human trafficking ring, you can actually go to a third world country where already your born human trafficking victims become the gestators who are now gestating all these babies. And then you've got your child human trafficking ring just 9 months away and just a couple years away. I mean, and we can't think this is even just theory. Oh, this could happen. I bet you this is already happening. Yeah. So this is thinking beyond stage one. What seems like, oh, just a simple solution. I mean, again, it's the same as the birth control debate when the Anglicans first allowed it, you know, it was the 1930s and the 1920s in the Lambeth Conference. People were like, oh, well, this is just for married couples, you know, so that they, and then now we have this situation where we've got this hookup culture and we've got, you know, all these other problems. So we have to think beyond stage one. So little points can be made without going into the human trafficking example, perhaps from the pulpit, but of, the problems that arise, and then the offering of wanting to personally journey with and counsel. Oh, and yeah, and then I would say and then the other piece of the recipe is what are the alternatives, which I also talk about in the book. So, which we've already briefly addressed, you know, if it's, you know, PCOS surgery, endometrial surgery, you know, hormone support and so forth. So that there are alternatives because people can be led to think there aren't. And you have to really search to get into the kind of the Catholic NAPRO technology, Creighton model of what's called restorative reproductive medicine. Even the use of progesterone while pregnant is alarmingly not common to me, to the point that I have been questioned. Really? My prescription by my NAPRO OBGYN, who is brilliant, and people travel from all over to get his surgery. And he's genius. My prescription at my pharmacist has been questioned by my pharmacist to the point that there was one day he didn't even fill it until he could call the doctor and confirm that that's really what he meant. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. My doctor knows what he's doing. Give me my progesterone. But so that's an example where it's kind of, there's this niche world of restorative reproductive medicine where we want to work with the body's natural rhythms. And it takes more trust, not because it's not effective. In fact, sometimes it's more effective than IVF. But IVF can feel like you're more in control because you're constantly doing, and you're taking those injections and you're getting your labs and you're doing all this stuff, and then someone else you've put a lot of money into it, and when you've dropped tens of thousands, if not more, 100,000 or more in the whole process, if you're hiring surrogates and so forth. You expect results, and they're going to give you results. So it's easy to run to that because it feels like you're more in control. And so for people to know there are alternatives. And then the other piece of the puzzle is to talk about accepting suffering, that we can do our best to try to get out of it. And a lot of times we can. But then acknowledging the truth that sometimes you can't solve the problem, because we can't give people also this false idea that for sure they will get a baby the natural way. That just sometimes doesn't happen.
Yeah. I really prefer the theological and the philosophical argument with this, but I can't help but have like a little bit of a conspiracy theorist approach to this also, which is just like how much money is being made in this. And actually, just to your point, when you say the manufacturer, that kind of puts into perspective actually what's happening, that this is a business, this is an industry. If we're paying women for their eggs, we're paying them for their biology. And again, then we're treating women as an object that we can use. Like, how much money can we get out of this woman, or how much money can we feed into her in order to get what we want? And then the consequences of having fertilized multiple eggs and created multiple embryos that can't be used, then we have to freeze them. Well, then there's a whole market for freezing embryos and keeping them in cold storage. There's a there just has to be so much money to be made in this that it would make me very suspect of the motives of the industry behind it, not of the motives of the people who are looking for this as a treatment, because they're seeking life. They really truly want to have a child. And in a certain way, I don't know, maybe this is me trying to be a generous pastor or something. I don't know, but like, I want to not blame parents who are looking for this with the best of intentions, but just blame a system that has commodified human life for them and told them that this is the thing that you're supposed to have. This is what you're entitled to. And here's how we can do it. We can, if you pay us this much money, we can make it happen for you. And to me, that just seems like it's greed. It's evil at its core. But we don't see that because we're looking for the good, and people who are good will look for good wherever they can find it and maybe get misled. I don't know. Follow the money, man, and something's wrong.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and I source a couple of different documentaries. There's a group that's produced 3 documentaries I can think of that I reference in the book. One is called Eggsploitation, and is specifically about women who have been financially incentivized to sell their eggs as young women who haven't had their own children yet. And then the physical complications that came from hyperstimulating the ovaries. Some of them will never have their own biological children as they know it through their own relationships, even though other people will be bearing their children because they sold their eggs. Because of physical complications that then resulted in hysterectomies and different things. So Eggsploitation. Another documentary by that group is called Anonymous Father's Day. I actually start the book in the introduction about that. And a man interviewed in it said, I have 500 to 1,000 half siblings around the world, because one sperm seller, again, people say sperm donors, but his sperm was used to create 500 to 1,000 embryos. And there's actually a sibling registry online now where people can look for genetic half siblings. There have been frightening stories. I tell of one in the book where there was a couple that married each other not knowing that they were genetic half siblings. Both knew that their parents, one was a daughter of lesbians and knew her parents had pursued that. And I think he actually knew his parents had too. He was never interested in his genetic background, and so didn't find out who his dad was, but the woman always knew, and she always wanted him to know because they had children. And she's like, look, if you know your genetic background like I do, then we can know if our children should be aware of certain diseases that could affect them in the future. So for their anniversary, he decided one year to go and find out who his biological father was. And no joke, it was the same biological man, or the same man who biologically fathered his wife. Crazy stuff happens. So Anonymous Father's Day, Eggsploitation, and then they have one called Breeders, which is all about surrogates and women being used to gestate children for other people, and then that leading things to being pregnant with a child who you discover as a genetic anomaly, and then the parents who contracted out the surrogate to gestate the child for them no longer want the child because the child's too sick. So then they want to force the surrogate to have an abortion, but then the surrogate doesn't want to have an abortion, but legally she's bound. There's just crazy things that happen. Yeah. So even spelling this out for our parishioners who in their moment of crisis might be thinking, well, that will never happen to me. Even when my book got released, the day of, a woman emailed me and said, I haven't read your book yet because it just came out, but I want to thank you for writing on this. Because in my naivete and my struggles with infertility years ago, I pursued IVF and had no idea the problem I was inviting into my life. And now I have 20 frozen embryos I don't know what to do with. And I'm in the ethical dilemma of what now? In fact, I have a whole appendix on what now, leaving it an open question, because that's a whole other complicated situation as well. But again, when you don't think beyond stage one, then we have,
Hmm.
and you start with an unethical act to begin with, then you're just going to get more and more unethical, confusing,
Right.
messy situations. But this
Yeah.
woman's email to me was a
Mm.
plea to others, like, I didn't know, and now I have a mess on my hands, and people need to be warned
Yeah.
about this.
Yeah.
Man. Um, no, we had a situation here in Connecticut a couple years ago at a fertility clinic where a couple conceived and had a baby, except that the embryo that was implanted in this woman's womb was not theirs. It belonged to another couple. And when the baby was born and was a different race than the couple, they were very surprised to find this and discovered that they had just given birth to another couple's baby. And that couple had no idea that the embryo had been implanted in somebody else. And it was just this like, it was one of those horror stories of everything that could go wrong going wrong. And
Right.
it's
I
heartbreaking to see things like that happen.
Oh yeah, and I actually, I don't know if it was the same story or a different one, but again, this happens more than once. I just watched a news story of couples that this happened to, and it wasn't discovered for, I think, 3 months.
Mm.
So everyone's just happy at birth and think, oh, the kid's got darker hair. But as the baby starts developing the first few weeks, they're like, something's a little off.
Something's wrong.
So
Yeah.
then they contact their fertility clinic. So by the time it was figured out that the wrong embryo was implanted in couple A, that their embryo still was implanted, but in couple B, and couple B's embryo was implanted. And sometimes you don't even get that. Sometimes only one of them makes it, and so one couple's going to be left childless. But
Right.
both couples had a baby in the story I saw, and then in about 3 months, the swap happened. Well, again, thinking beyond stage one, like, what does this do to the child? Sure, there's the emotional turmoil for the parents, but the each infant bonded to the mother whose womb they were in and to the parents who took care of them for the first 3 months of their life.
Right.
Now you are ripping that bond from that precious child and transferring it over to someone else. Yes, is it their actual biological parents? Yes. Do they really love them and want the child? Yes. But those pivotal first few months of bonding and attachment, which are so important for healthy human development, have been very brutally attacked. And
Yeah.
if we think this isn't going to have implications on the child, we're very wrong.
Oh man, no, it's so painful to hear. It's interesting because I think this is like it's a mentality that is creeping in other places. I've I really appreciate that you're using the word manufacture. I've been using commodification.
Mm,
Um, I guess same side of or different side of the same coin, maybe. Like manufacture, like treating children as a commodity, and I've noticed this coming up a lot. If you read about somebody uh, who's made the news somehow, uh, it's an actor, it's a musician, it could be almost anything. The phrasing that they'll use now is not, Joe and his wife Nancy have 3 children. It's they share children together,
mm,
as though like the children somehow are not connected to them, but they share them. Like it's a
yeah,
toy. We shared this toy. We shared a meal together.
right,
There's
right.
something really disingenuous about that, and it bothers me every time I read it. Like, no, you don't
Mhm.
share children. You together you have children, and
Right.
there's the bond of the two of you together with that child, and it's a very it's a very subtle thing, and I don't know, maybe there are people who are more into grammar than I am. That's hard to do, but anyway, there might be some people who read that and think that it does sound nicer, but there's just something off about it, you know?
Right. Yeah. Well, we are very much living in a culture, and certainly the industry of IVF. I mean, each individual couple, they could say differently, but the overall overarching industry is not at all ordered to children, as much as the industry on the surface looks like it is, because it's all about making children. But why are we
Right,
making children? Because the whole industry is ordered to parental desires,
right,
the desires of adults, and again, it comes down to the dignity of the person, that these are actual human beings, and children might be younger and they might be less developed, but there are equals. There are equals in dignity and value and being made in God's image and willed by God, and to be respected as God wants all of us respected. So we can't overlook the impact all of this has, not only on the couples, like this woman who acknowledged, now I'm in this terrible moral dilemma of what do I do with these 20 actual children of mine? But each one of those children, what's to be said of them?
Yeah.
Yes, they're not old enough to be able to voice anything. They haven't been given the chance to develop enough to be able to voice anything, but a profound injustice has been done to them.
Yeah.
And we can't overlook the toll. And then for those, speaking earlier about people conceived as a result of IVF. And again, I share some of those stories in my book. There is an organization where people go online and just share their stories of what it's like to come to know you were conceived as a result of sperm sellers or egg sellers. And when you read the testimony of these people who are glad to be alive, but really bothered and psychologically traumatized over what they've learned about their biological parents, or over the fact that they attempted to make contact, let's say, with their biological dad, and he wants nothing to do with them. And so there is this deep-seated yearning for one's family of origin, their roots, their belonging, and then this rejection from the father. And then you take this from a faith perspective, where so often the earthly experience of fatherhood is what puts in our heart what should be our experience with God the Father. But if your experience with God the Father, or with the experience of your biological father, is negative, then you can have a skewed negative view of who God is as Father. So the implications on the child, him or herself, not only as a child put in jeopardy in a freezer, but as a child who's now an adult coming to terms with identity and rootedness and family and fatherhood and God. This is really tough on these people, and we can't make light of that.
Yeah. No, it's such a brutal thing. I had one other question, but I thinking about this, it got me realizing, like, embryo adoption. I've seen stories of couples who are aware of this reality. Embryo adoption also doesn't sit right with me. And I think I'm on pretty solid ethical and moral theological grounds there. But I can, at the same time that I know that it's essentially surrogacy. They'll take an embryo that has been abandoned in a freezer somewhere. But it is essentially, it's surrogacy, but there is a beautiful desire to recognize the personhood that is there frozen. And at the same time, like it's like trying to make the best out of a very bad situation. But I don't know, it seems to me, and tell me what you think, but it just seems to me like it's not actually going to make that situation better.
Yeah.
And maybe
go ahead.
Well, I might be wrong about that, but there's just something that's not quite right. And help me reason through that a little bit.
Well, yeah. So I have wrestled with this question for years, and ultimately included in appendix what to do with frozen embryos. That doesn't take a conclusive decision, which some people were critical of and said, like, just pick a side. But I think the fact that it is so messy, it is difficult. So what I wanted to do was present what can be the good motivations of people pursuing it, but then being like, ooh, but then this problem's created. Ooh, but then this problem's created.
Yeah.
So I would say embryo adoption is different from surrogacy in that surrogacy says a child does not exist. I want to hire you to gestate a child I will bring into existence, and I'm going to use you for the womb, but I want the baby after. And embryo adoption is very different. The embryo already exists, is most likely abandoned by the biological parents. And someone says, you need a uterus the way a born child might need to be breastfed. And I will offer my uterus and rescue you for your good and your sake. And when you come to term, I will parent you. So I would say it's different. It doesn't mean it's right, though. And
Yeah.
so I would say,
That's a helpful distinction, though, just to make that difference
yes,
clear. That's really good. Thank you.
yes. And so then it becomes a question of, um, if I if I myself, for example, had a frozen embryo implant inserted in me, I am occupying my womb for the next 9 months with someone else's child.
Hmm.
If, as I seem to, I have the ability to at least conceive children with my own husband, even though often they miscarry, um, is there something wrong there by filling my womb and occupying it for more than a year? Because there's the gestating and then the initial infertility that would come with having just had a baby. Should I be prioritizing having my own children? Is it different from rescuing a born orphan because I could still get pregnant and have other children while I care for a needy child? Whereas in this case, I'm occupying the womb such that I wouldn't have a child with my husband during that season. At what point should I prioritize that? So then someone might say, well, what about a couple whose husband has total infertility and they would never conceive, but she has the ability? So then that can seem more compelling because then you're not doing it. You could argue you're doing it for the good of the child and not for yourself. So some people say, well, if you're using it to solve infertility, then that's a problem. But then other people would say, yes, but the child wouldn't have gotten into the stranger's womb without IVF. So the sin of creating the child is over. But is the creation of the child so closely linked to the gestation of a child that there shouldn't be a third party inserting someone into your body? So there's so many layers, but then someone might say, no, the sin really is over. And if you would go back and rescue your own children, would it be ethical? So here's a question. If you come to realize, like the woman did of the 20 children that are her own, if we say, well, I'm uncomfortable with embryo adoption, does she have a moral duty to go back for as many as possible? And if we say she does, then it necessitates a third party inserting her own children in her body.
Right.
Is that ethical? And then if we say that is ethical because it's her own children, we're still acknowledging that there's something different after the conception, which should have happened in sexual intimacy. We're saying there's got to be something different to allow the third party to insert her own children back in her body. Because if we said it's unethical over here because a third party's inserting, then even for your own children, it wouldn't be ethical. So I could keep unpacking it or just say, get the book and read the appendix. But,
Yeah.
but
That's
the
probably
point
a
is,
safe bet.
there's a lot of layers, a lot of things to think about. If we do this, then what?
Yeah. Well, maybe that may be the most important note, and something for us to end on too, is that these issues they're very real. They are complex. There are some simple answers that we can give to certain elements of it, but if we really want to have the fuller conversation, and I think also remove it from the political sphere. This is not a political issue. This is a human life issue, and except insofar as that which is political, the human society and everything. Yeah. I get it. But this is not about partisan politics. Is really the best way to say it. This isn't about being liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat. This is about human life, and therefore, to come back to our original point. No, I've decided that a single tweet or a social media post is not adequate for this. The only way is to read the Dignity series, to which Stephanie Gray Connors has been a tremendous contributor. And stay tuned for more. You can find it at Word on Fire. Stephanie, thank you so much for being on the tangent today. This is awesome. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Father. It was a great conversation.
Thanks for watching today's video. Let us know what you thought down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.